The book that I actually wrote is called The Peace River Boundary, and it's based upon events that took place in this area from, I would say, the late 1830s up until the late 1860s. The river itself first became a boundary back in the 1830s. And at that time, we had the Second Seminole War going on, and it was a long war, started in the early 1830s, went on throughout the 1830s into the 1840s. By 1839, President Martin Van Buren was becoming very concerned about the cost of the war, and it was taking up 10 to 15% of the entire national budget. And he was very concerned about funding the national government at that time, so he sent General Alexander Macomb, who was the commanding officer of the entire United States Army at that point, down to Florida with the orders to stop in the Second Seminole War. And General Macomb really didn't know exactly how to go about this, and it was suggested that the Seminoles probably want something, give it to them. So he comes down, takes a number of weeks coming down through, the Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, finally gets to Gary's Ferry, which is a base up there near Jacksonville, and he wants to find some Seminole to cut a deal, but he doesn't find any Seminole there, and the people there say, well, you're probably going to have to go down to Fort King, and Fort King is where Ocala is now. So he goes all the way down the demarcation road, and that demarcation road was set up many years ago after the First Seminole War. And the demarcation road in those days went from around Jacksonville through Ocala down through to Tampa. And at that point, the Seminole had been assured that if they go south of that road, they could stay there, I guess, indefinitely. And they actually went down in that area. They established farms, plantations, they had cattle, all this sort of thing. But then as people were coming down from the north, they realized that there was a lot of good land south of that demarcation road. But so they got involved with this whole situation, battling over this territory. At any rate, back to the story, Macomb, he goes all the way down the demarcation road to Fort King, Ocala, and Fort King was sort of a ramshackle place, and the people who were assigned to Fort King, Union Army troops at that time, Federal Army, weren't very happy to be there, because the story was at that time there were a lot of ways to die in Florida, and none of them were especially pleasant. And that could be everything from malaria, yellow fever, being bit by one of the various snakes down here, and getting involved with the Indian confrontations. At any rate, what happened is when General Macomb got to Fort King, they waited until some of the Seminole came in to pick up supplies, and at that point, they found some Indians, and he wanted to know if we could negotiate with these Indians. And the Indian agent there said, well, maybe one of them might be a chief. So what they decided to do was they put up a big sort of a meeting lodge outside of the fort, and General Macomb went to the difficulty of bringing all of his very nice uniforms down with him. So he got all dressed up, and he brought a brass band that he brought down from Gary's Ferry, and the band played Hail to the Chief, and he goes out into the tent area to actually meet with a Seminole, and he did not speak Seminole, so he wanted someone to do the translation, and they said they had a slave that they had recaptured from the Seminole, and the slave could speak Seminole. So they get out here in the big tent, and he gets ready, and General Macomb gives a very long, flowery speech, and the slave, he starts translating it. And when he finished, one of the Indians there said, oh, he got most of it right because the Indians could speak English. So I guess the conversation went on for a few days, and at that point, General Macomb offered them a solution. He said, we'll leave you alone. You can go down. If you go south, of, and they brought out a big chart. You go south and east of Pea Creek. Pea Creek was a river that runs about 100 and some miles, come down through and comes into Charlotte Harbor here, and you go south and east of Pea Creek, and you can live there in peace forever. And as a matter of fact, they thought that was such a good idea. In the proclamation that General Macomb put out ending the Second Seminole War in 1839, he referred to this river as the Peace River rather than as Pea Creek. And that's what some people say where the name came from, the Peace River. The idea being that the Seminole come on this side of the Peace River, they could live here and be here for forever, forever and always. And the white people could come down on that side of the Peace River and they could be over there. And the federal government even set up an Armed Occupation Act after that point. And the Armed Occupation Act would give tracts of land on that side of the river if people would come down, establish a homestead, but they had to be able to carry weapons and defend the homestead. And this took place in about 1839. What we have then is we have the Second Seminole War goes on probably until, I would say, the early 1840s. And finally the war comes to an end. We have the Peace River out here, which is supposed to be the boundary for forever, forever and always. And that lasts for about 10 years before we have this Third Seminole War. And the Third Seminole War occurs because they find out there's a lot of good land on this side of the river. And the Third Seminole War is a sort of a guerrilla activity. In the book I talk about the ending of the Second Seminole, I talk about the Third Seminole. See, Florida was initially a territory, it eventually becomes a state, but Florida was kind of at the perimeter of all of the decisions being made elsewhere at that time. The decisions, many of the decisions were being made up in Washington, other decisions were being made in Tallahassee, and the impact of these decisions was falling upon the people who actually lived down here. And that's what we're getting involved with in the book. To some degree, I'm talking about what happens when very ordinary people get into positions of extraordinary power. And we take a look at some of the policies put through by the presidents, the members of the Senate, what have you at that time. And eventually we come to the point of where in the late 1850s, probably the most qualified man in the world to ever become president of the United States was James Buchanan, probably the most qualified. And James Buchanan came into office with the avowed purpose of seizing Cuba. And he even was involved when he was serving as an ambassador in Europe with the Ostend Manifesto, which said that the United States, as part of its manifest destiny, was supposed to go into Cuba. And if you want to go back to manifest destiny, we mentioned that. That was an idea, a concept thought up by a woman, Jane McManus Storm, and she sort of gets overlooked in the history books because she was very involved with the revolution in Texas, and then she gets sent to Havana, and she is working in Havana. All of this is going on, but Mr. Buchanan was really not successful in this goal because at that point there was a new political party in the North, the Republican Party, which comes into power at that time, takes control of the United States House of Representatives. And I would say probably the United States House of Representatives was about as effective getting things done at that time as they are these days, but that's another whole issue, okay? Nevertheless, all of this is going on in the 1850s, and then lo and behold, because of the Republican Party rising to power up north, they pick out a railroad attorney by the name of Lincoln, and they run him for president in 1860. And he doesn't show up on any of the ballots down here. Nobody down here had a chance to vote for him. But they voted for him up north, and the Democrats had some difficulty in 1860. They went to, I believe it was Charleston, and they had a convention there. and they had 56 votes trying to pick out a candidate to run for president, and they couldn't do it. So after 56 votes, they go home. Now, the Northern Democrats, they meet up in Baltimore, and they pick Mr. Douglas from Illinois to run for president. Southern Democrats, they get together in Richmond, and they pick Mr. Breckinridge to run for president. And the people who didn't like Douglas and the people who didn't like Breckinridge, they met and they picked Mr. Bell to run for president. So the Democrats ran 3 candidates for president in 1860, which was an interesting situation. And the Republicans up north ran 1 candidate, and when that 1 candidate won the election, people in the South were shocked, horrified, dismayed, and they started dropping out of the Union. South Carolina dropped out, Florida dropped out soon thereafter, and they had a big celebration up in Tampa. They were really happy to leave the Union, become a separate independent state. And that's when we get all involved with what was happening down here during the American Civil War. And as I said, there was a lot of support for the Confederacy in North Florida, but down in South Florida, we had a different situation. Key West was the largest city in the state at the time, Key West. And people don't normally think of that these days. It was the largest city in the state. Key West was originally established by people coming out of Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. They definitely had northern leanings, northern support. And they were involved with the commerce and trade, and it was a much different situation than what was the case up north. The people coming into this region, southern Florida, slavery was not a big issue down here. The people did not own many slaves. And whereas slavery was big in North Florida, not an issue down here. And the people down here were primarily independent settlers, farmers, what have you. And when the Confederacy needed manpower and needed money to support the Civil War, they got involved with taxation. They sent the tax collectors down into this area to take people's, cattle, things like that, in lieu of taxes. And then they passed the Conscription Act, which would say if you were between 18 and 40 years old, you could be called up to serve in the Confederate forces. The men down here did not want to do that. So many of the men left their land and they moved out to Usepa Island. And they all moved out there waiting for the Civil War to end. Now the Union Navy controlled this area, and the Union Navy fed these people, okay, which is a nice thing to do. And as a result, the Union Navy supported them, and they formed a Union Rangers organization using Florida men, and that later on became the 2nd Florida Cavalry Union, which was stationed over at Fort Myers. Now, in the book itself, I talk about how 2 of the characters up north at the time of the American Civil War, they're up around Fort Meade. One fellow, he's running away because they're trying to get him into the Confederate Army, but they found out that initially he was a Yankee, so they chase him out of town, and he ends up down by the Peace River up in Fort Meade. And he runs into the fellow he knew before, Floyd, who was a black slave initially, and they come down the Peace River in a dugout canoe. And when they get into the mangrove swamps, which are farther up the river here, the mangrove islands and that type of thing, they encounter the arms Union ship Rosalie chasing a blockade runner, and the Rosalie captures the blockade runner, and after they capture the blockade runner, they take the 2 characters, it'll be Floyd and Harry, aboard, and because Floyd happens to be black, they put him into the United States Navy, which they were doing at that time, and they take Harry back to Key West. And because Harry had the experience of being involved in the Second Seminole War and what have you, Harry is given a commission, actually in a Pennsylvania regiment, figure that out. And then later on, he's sent over to Usepa Island to organize the troops over there, and they go back and they take over Fort Meade. And then at one point they take the people from Fort Meade up and they capture and take from Fort Myers up and they capture Fort Meade. But all of these things are talking about, all of these things happened here in this area from about 1839 up until roughly 1865. Big impact upon what later on happened in American history, big impact upon what happened down here in years following that time. There's sort of a saying down here. And when you come to the state of Florida, the farther south you go, the more northern it becomes. And a lot of that has to do with the influence of Key West and what took place back here in this area back in the late 1800s. But that's what the book's about, and that's what the story is all about. And this, of course, is the harbor, Charlotte Harbor. And if you can't see it, but up north here, you see the Peace River coming on down through. That's what the book's about.